recording for now the last 2 minutes. I'm looking, and the microphone, it wasn't even on. He did it without a microphone, everybody. But this behind me, as I mentioned, while the microphone was off, I think, is just whatever comes on when I turn on the TV. I think it's, someone and someone, the YouTube guys. Rhett and someone, I don't know. That looks like a weird version of Tucker Carlson. But the interview today on Unauthorized Opinions is with Joe Brennan. We talked about him being banned from a Magic the Gathering tournament for wearing a MAGA hat. They said there was complaints about his behavior. They won't tell him. So he was banned. He sort of fought that. The people got backlash against him for supporting him. I think he mentioned death threats. They mentioned, extorting people to donate to pro left-wing causes. Crazy stuff like that. There was a little bit of audio trouble at the beginning. I don't know if it was my connection or his. He's out in Pennsylvania. I jiggered with the Ethernet cord. It fixes itself after a few minutes, so don't fret. And if you're worried this gets too nerdy in the weeds of nerd for you, as you probably aren't worried about that if you're a fan of this channel. It's more about, like the insane politics that are going around this community. So I hope you enjoy it. Like, share, subscribe. YouTube, Rumble, X. He's on X, everybody. The people watching this that are left-wing aren't going to like that. They're not going to like a lot of things. You're going to enjoy this because it's a segment of not just the population, but a genre of something or other that you might not hear about very often. And you're going to be like, well, this is a guy who's very smart and he really knows what he's talking about. And he's very, very reasonable. And hopefully people listen to him, and hopefully people come together and don't continue to do what they've done, which you'll hear about in this episode. So thanks a lot for watching. Joe Brennan is his name. He's from Pennsylvania. And stick around to the end, because he sniffs out the accent. He sniffs out the boots. He sniffs it out. He sniffs it out good. And I don't like it. I don't like when people say that. Oh, you sound like you're from Michigan. Oh, you sound like you're from Wisconsin. Well, the Pennsylvanians have an accent too. It's all bad. It's all so sad. And it's different. They're not pronouncing the T's. It's certain places. All right? So let's ease up on the Canadianisms. Unauthorized Opinions, uopod.com. Support us on Patreon. We're doing all the hand motions if you're an audio listener. Support us. Like and share and subscribe. Thanks, and see you next time. Here's Joe Brennan. Imagine if I got his name wrong like this whole time. That'd be hilarious. Joe, thanks for joining me. Where are you coming to us from right now?
Right now I'm in Pittsburgh. I live in eastern Pennsylvania, but right now I'm in Pittsburgh because the Eternal Weekend is going on here, and I had an Airbnb rented here, even though I'm not allowed to play in the event. I was responsible for bringing a few European guests over here, and taking care of the check-in and check-out, the Airbnb and all that stuff. Kind of wanted to see everybody anyway.
So for sure, for anybody who's not familiar, Magic the Gathering, simplest put, is a card game, fantasy style card game. A lot of people won't be familiar with it, but enough people that watch this channel love video games, and no doubt they've heard of it. What
Sure.
people may not have heard of is the fact that this big card tournament, which was put on by Card Titan. How big of a company are they, by the way? Are they the biggest ones, or do they put on the most tournaments or anything like that?
Well, I would say so. Magic can be broken down into different formats, and the formats that I play are like the older formats, the Legacy and Vintage. I would say that Card Titan is the company who hosts the largest tournament for those formats. But there are other companies who are
Okay.
larger that host more commonly played formats.
Okay, so what ended up happening is this company released a statement about, without naming anybody, they said that past complaints were made about certain players, and certain conduct was made and discussed that resulted in people basically violating, let's call it, their terms and services, or their conduct agreement. And they didn't name you, but this came at the same time that Card Titan had told you personally that you couldn't play. I personally, when I wrote about the story, looked up, to the best of my knowledge, your record in tournaments, and you've won a whole bunch. Like you've won some this year, you've won some last year. You have a long history of in certain forms of certain, as you were describing, play styles of the game. And they decided one of the top players in the country was not allowed to play in this tournament. So can you tell us what it was like? How did you get informed that you weren't allowed from to play in the tournament? And did they give you any sort of reason as to why they weren't going to allow you?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a lot to be said about this. There's a whole lot of backstory that doesn't involve Card Titan specifically and stuff that will add context. I'm sure we'll get to that later. But essentially, about 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, I woke up to an email from Card Titan stating that my badge and my entry fee for this year's Eternal Weekend were being refunded. And because of reports of my behavior last year, I would not be allowed to enter the hall or to participate in this year's event. Um, Now, I know the owner of the company and the kind of the top manager of the company. I've known them for years, probably I don't know, 13 years or something like that. And I have their personal cell phone numbers in my phone and stuff. So my immediate response was to call them to get some clarification. The owner of the company did not answer my call. I called him a few times over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, and sent him a couple texts, but didn't receive any responses from him. I did speak with the manager of the company, and basically we had a good like 30-minute conversation. But you know, and I guess I should preface this by saying that at this point, I don't believe that Card Titan in any way was discriminating against me like past companies certainly have. But basically, the long and short of it was that there were reports of some of my behavior the previous year, and that I was not allowed to know what those reports were or who the people who were making the allegations were. And a whole year later, now I was being banned from this event from these, you know, to me, anonymous reports, and I didn't have any recourse or any appeals process that would normally be given when there's any type of a game rule violation or a behavioral violation. There's always a judge involved. There's a judge report, and both sides tell their story. The judge will issue a ruling. The accused will either accept the ruling or they choose to appeal it to a higher judge, and eventually to the tournament organizer. And then the higher judge or the tournament organizer's ruling stands. You may disagree with it, but that's generally the process. None of this actually took place, with me, and I was pretty upset about it, and it was a little odd to me because I've never heard of a player getting banned without knowing what they were accused of, and certainly not being notified about it a year later after participating in numerous of that company's tournaments throughout this year at their brick and mortar location. But like I said, I do not believe at this point that they were discriminating against me politically. But I do believe that the most likely scenario is probably that whoever made the underlying complaints or whatever they were I assume were just politically motivated. And then, it's kind of like the whole, believe the accuser, and, the accuser has to remain anonymous in order for their own protection or whatever the case may be, which, maybe there's some legitimacy to that argument. But obviously the reason that we have due process in basically any justice system is to prevent false allegations. And then the other thing is, if we issue penalties in order to disincentivize unwanted behavior, then how do you achieve that goal if the penalized person is never even allowed to know what that alleged behavior is?
Uh, Joe, you're known as sort of like the guy who wears a MAGA hat. In my research about you, I was able to find posts going back to, I think, 2019. Correct me if I'm wrong, if this started before or after that, but I think going back to 2019, at least 2023, where people were calling for you to be banned from tournaments, calling you a neo-Nazi, calling you a white supremacist just because you wore a MAGA hat. Can you tell us how long you've been wearing a MAGA hat to tournaments for, why you started doing it, and if anything, like, have any altercations ever come about because of you wearing a hat at tournaments.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, so this is where it gets this is a very lengthy story. It's been going on for a long time. So essentially, for a long time, I was pretty much kind of viewed as like the ambassador for this format, at least in my opinion, and kind of the poster child for vintage, because I gotten cheated out of what we call the World Championship, but it's the North American Eternal Weekend in 2016, and it was like a big deal. You know, they made like a documentary about it because there was like a bunch of video evidence of my opponent cheating, and it was like a really big deal for me because it was like something I worked very hard at. I had won all the other major tournaments that year, and I kind of felt like the rug got pulled out from under me. But then 3 years later, I came back to win that tournament, and I did it in kind of like a comical way that the context will probably be lost on most people
Hold
listening
on
to
a
this. But
second. It's getting choppy. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm gonna
yep, no worries.
re. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I said so. In 2019, I came back and won the tournament in a way that became famous not just from the rebound story, but there was context that most people probably won't understand. But I used my cards in a peculiar way that many people found very comical. So it became like a viral video of how I won uh, the tournament by turning my Black Lotus into an elk with another card, and it was kind of a big thing. And at that point, I mean, after I won, it was like they dropped the velvet rope that was tying everybody back, and the whole like convention center was like you know in tears. I was in tears. It was hugging everybody. It was like this you know big amazing moment in my life. And shortly after that, we had like the lockdowns and all types of things that kind of really polarized the country politically. And um, in Magic, it's kind of like, I guess the best way that I could say is it's kind of like the Seattle or the Portland of political culture. In our little subculture, it's extremely one-sided, and the dissenting opinions are certainly not welcome and really viewed as like a threat, like almost like fascism, and basically those left-wing displays were prevalent at all these tournaments. And I liked Trump, so I was like, well, I'm going to wear my political displays too. Like there were Bernie Sanders, like a parody of Bernie Sanders campaign sign with like a magic card called Marit Lage, um, kind of conglomeration in it. And then like the Obama change shirts, and then more recently more egregious things like the From the River to the Sea shirts, and Hail Satan and smoke meth. And not that that's necessarily political, but maybe unacceptable by some people. And then even last year at this tournament, there was a player that had a playmat with Trump's bloody severed head next to a guillotine on it. So I mean, I assumed. I don't know that I assumed. I mean, I certainly had the understanding that I was going to be viewed somewhat as a contrarian by doing so, but I felt it was my every bit my right to be allowed the same freedoms that everyone else was at the events, and it wouldn't be biasly enforced. But I was very wrong about that. In fact, at this point, I've been kicked out of, I think, the majority of the tournaments in the northeastern U.S., whether it be on a small game store level. Numerous game stores have banned me. A few large tournaments like the Legacy Pit, now this year's Eternal Weekend. And at those, well, this year's tournament aside, all of those circumstances were strictly because of my hat. There was never any issue with any of my behavior, any of my gameplay, anything like that. It was very clearly that, like, no, 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 you're not allowed because you're wearing a "Make America Great Again" hat, even though there's other people in the room wearing the left wing ideological symbols on their clothing, or hats, or whatever the case may be. Um, so there's a lot of context leading up to it. I mean, I fly overseas to play a lot of tournaments. I go to Italy like 5 times a year, and Japan once a year, and whenever there's other tournaments like in Prague or Paris or Spain, or then I always end up
Mm-hmm.
playing in those events. And I've never had any of those types of issues overseas. It seems to just be kind of a cultural thing here. But yeah, it's gotten pretty egregious. Like some of the some of the things that are said about me and said to me. Like I get called a Nazi all the time. I get, people give me the finger and things that would certainly never be acceptable if I were to respond in kind in the other direction. I would be banned from life for life from this game. But it's certainly acceptable in one direction. But to me, and I really, really want to focus on this because I'm of the very strong opinion that if we continue to stay stuck in this space, we're going in a very dark direction. There's no way forward if everyone's kind of trapped in their own echo chambers and like labeling the other side as something heinous. And it's true to some extent on both sides, although my bias is to believe that it's much larger on one side than the other, but I'm sure the other side feels the same way. um, but my view is that there are a lot of very powerful interests that profit from our division, funding propaganda to make us believe things about the other side and to keep us divided and fighting with each other so they can steal all our money to go blow up kids overseas and centralize their power. And, we're not enemies. We're just people. We're on the same team, and the whole point is that, in my view, is that we are propagandized to believe that we are enemies and that we need to keep fighting against each other so we can stay distracted from all that. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere by going tit for tat. I think the only path forward is through someone has to take the high road. You know, someone has to understand that this isn't a level playing field and be accepting of that for in pursuit of the end result of unity. And I mean, that's kind of my view on it, and it seems to me like nobody on either side is really doing that.
I want to ask you because I go to some video game stores. There's not like I have friends who play the game. I don't know how much they do it anymore, but they were pretty serious about it before. And I can only think of one place nearby that I've been to where it's very clearly a big thing. And what I find is almost all but a couple, hobby stores, game stores, vintage stores, card stores that I've been to are explicitly left wing, and this extends even to places that have board games, places that are coffee shops. The one place I'm thinking of has a trans flag hanging in their like above like their card section, and I do wonder why they think that's an acceptable thing. I do wonder why they don't see the hypocrisy when something like this happens with you. Like if somebody wears a political hat they disagree with, they freak out because they wouldn't like it if a card store just had a big Trump flag hanging in it, for example. But they cannot handle it when it goes. When it's their side, it's fine. When it goes the other way, we all have seen that they can't handle it. Is it your experience that most of these places, you mentioned getting kicked out of stores, most of these places are overtly left wing? I don't go to many, if any, purely card spots where people are playing. Like I've been in some where people do this stuff and they play Warhammer as well and other types of hobby games like that. But how does that happen where you get banned from a store? Do you walk in and somebody says, "Get out, I don't want your business"? Or do they sort of like, are they holding tournaments at these stores and you hear about it and get banned that way?
Yeah. So, well, I guess that question's somewhat multifaceted. I guess I'll start by saying that I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with a company having a political opinion or even a community having a political opinion that skews in one direction or another. Like we have the same thing on the right. Like you're not going to see too many left wing symbols at a gun shop or at a steakhouse or anything like that. But where I think it becomes a problem is when we allow those differences to cause us to behave in a way that is really harmful. Like my view on free speech is I have the right to speak freely until my speech or my exercising of that right is starting to infringe on your ability to do the same. And basically, yeah, most of the time it's just me walking into the store, having my hat on, and I haven't worn a MAGA hat in probably, I don't know, like 4 months or so because I'm not thrilled about the Epstein cover up. But that's my decision. It shouldn't be up to somebody else what I wear, or if it is, have some type of policy that says no political attire, not just
Hmm.
no political attire in one direction. It's that's at least that's my view on it. But basically, most of the time I would just walk into the store, and oftentimes it was stores that had known me for years, but and they would say, "Hey, either you have to leave um, without really any discussion, or some of them would say you have to either take your hat off and leave." And then I would say, "Well, how come it's acceptable for like that guy to wear his Black Lives Matter shirt or whatever, and it's not, or that From the River to the Sea shirt, and it's not acceptable for me to wear my stuff." Like I don't. My issue is not so much the left wing nature of it. I mean, I don't really care what anybody's political views are. It's just more of an interest of fairness. Like I think that we should all just be playing by the same rules. And then sometimes it was, more overt than that. Like, some people. I don't want to get into the business of like specifically calling out names of people and things like that, but like there was like one store in specific that had and the guy, this was like kind of what really shocked me about it because the owner was of the same political viewpoints as me, and because of the backlash from the community, he said, "Hey, you can't come here anymore. We're not going to allow political attire here anymore." And I said, "But like I was just there yesterday and there's a guy with a Black Lives Matter hoodie on." And I'm not saying he shouldn't be allowed to wear that, but I know for a fact you're not going to have this conversation with that guy because, that would be front page news. And, so the guy was like, "Yeah, no, it'll be applied equally." And at the time I was dating, a girl who was managing the restaurant across the street, and all those guys would come over there and eat at her restaurant after the tournaments, and everybody was wearing their left wing political attire still. She would tell me, and I mean, whatever, it is what it is. But that guy then, a year or two later, came out to a game store by me in Pennsylvania. This was in New Jersey, and then apologized, and he said, "Hey, listen, like that wasn't right. I'm having a charity tournament for a mutual friend whose daughter needs a surgery. I think your presence there would bring a lot of attention. It's just like a small game store, and I've had a lot of success in this game. And I'd really appreciate if you came out and supported the charity, but I promise you we'll never have an issue like that again." So I'm like, okay. So I came out, I, made some donations to the charity, and I played in the event, and there wasn't any issue. And then the next time I showed up to the store for the event, for a different event, um, as soon as I walked in the door, and I spoke with the guy, like I texted with the guy a few days before that next event. I said, "Hey, I'm coming this weekend. How do I register my deck list? Can I use the store credit I have there on entry fee?" "Yeah, yeah, looking forward to seeing you." And then I drove, an hour and 45 minutes to get there, and he kicks me out in front of everybody as soon as I walk in the door, as if he was like, look, it seemed to me like he was looking to make a public spectacle, like a virtue signal, and that was one of the more egregious scenarios. But there's a bunch of situations like that. But I don't really, I don't really want to dwell like so much on the problem as the solution. But I will say this one other situation that did really kind of bother me. So I've really tried a lot to give selflessly to this community to try to foster like a family type of feeling for newer players to come in. And you know, and there's a tournament called the NYSE. It's like the most expensive vintage tournament in the world. It's a high entry fee. It's very high prize pool. A lot of prestige attached to it. And my friend organizes the event, and he said, "Joe, listen, like this was in 2019. He said this is going to be the last NYSE. Um, I'm running this at a loss now for a couple years, and I just can't afford to invest all of the time and money into doing this again." And I said, "Listen, don't sweat it. I'm going to go win the event and I will give you back the first place prize, which was 4 Mishra's workshops. At that time, I don't know, maybe it's like $8,000 worth of product or whatever. And I'm like, I will give you back that prize and you'll be able to run the next event. Use that as your startup money. And I did that. I went to the tournament. I won the tournament. He tried to decline, but I left the cards there on the table. I gave them to him. And, you know, and then I left the event, and I mean, I'm in close contact with this guy. He's a great friend of mine and a huge asset and really a pillar of our community. But the very next time that tournament happened, there was a petition among the community to have me banned from the tournament. Now, these players didn't know what I had done. They didn't know that that tournament would not have existed were it not for my, what I had done the previous year. But it was like, man, like that really kind of hurt, because I had spent so many years in this community doing things like that. Like usually, when I win credit or whatever at stores at tournaments, I just try to have kids on Friday night be able to do a booster draft for free from courtesy of an anonymous donation from the vintage community. So those kids kind of see that and they're like, wow, man, those guys are great. One of these days, I'm going to be that guy for the next little kid that comes through. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why this whole thing has kind of stung so much because it's not like I was like an asshole in this community. I mean, like I was really a beloved member of this community up until everybody found out that I voted like the other half of the country that they didn't agree with, and then it was like the teeth came out. But I really don't want to focus so much on um, like the poor me, woe is me type of victim mentality. Like I want to try to move towards a solution. And I don't really know exactly how to go about that, but I think that where it stands right now, I'm very happy with the way that, so I'm not happy at all with the way that Card Titan handled the whole situation. Um, because I'm certain that it would not have been handled in the same way were it somebody on the left. But I do not believe that they were actually making this ban just out of discrimination. In fact, from what I understand, at a tournament at their brick and mortar store at some point over the past year, one of their employees came to the management and tried to have me kicked out because of my hat, and the management had refused, and the employee actually walked out and quit as a result of it. And these guys have like I had nothing bad to say about these guys up until this point, although obviously there was some serious procedural issues and there's a policy that, you don't, they're not telling you the accusation that's alleged against you when they ban you. And I have a big issue with that, but, and the whole process that this went through. But I mean, historically, I've never had any problems like that with this company. And I really, they deserve credit for that because they haven't followed suit where it has become commonplace to really kind of target me personally, but really anybody who's not, of a far left wing ideology, and they haven't fallen into that trap. And I do believe that they didn't fall into it necessarily this time, at least not to a large extent. Like there probably was actually complaints made, although my speculation is that those complaints were probably based out of some type of justification in the complainant's head about, me because I'm a Nazi or what, you know what I mean? Like the, and, so although I've never heard of anybody else, having a ban like this, it seems kind of like obvious to me that like you can't do that because you can't run any type of a society or even a subculture like this game like that. Otherwise, anyone can accuse anyone of anything if they
Mm-hmm.
don't like that person.
All
And
right,
then
let
there's
me
no
jump in here.
progress. Sure.
Sorry. Yeah, let me jump in here and we'll get to this letter and we'll get to the solution that you've done with Card Titan. The first thing
Yeah.
I want to say is the move that you made of, I'm going to win this tournament and give the stuff back to you. It's a G move, as they say, as the kids used to say. And I can always support moves like that. And giving back to it is very nice. And it is heartbreaking to hear that, you're holding parts of his community up as one of the best players, I'm going to assume, of all time, given that it's only been around, 30 years or so now. And it's not appreciated or it's just not known about that. And hopefully people knowing about that will maybe have them take a little bit of a change of heart. So after you were banned from this tournament, do we want to say this guy's name that I've spoken to, or do you want to keep his name
Well,
secret?
no, no, no. I think Connor's comfortable with us
Okay.
mentioning his
All
name.
right.
I mean, his name is, he's the author of the letter. He's a law professor at Washington University, and he really did a lot, um, to try to help us bring some clarity and some justice here, and find a solution moving forward.
So what he did is he formulated a letter to the company Card Titan, and he basically said, "Tell me if I'm summarizing it poorly," but he basically said you were banned, you weren't told why, they haven't given the reason or given shown any of the complaints, and there's a whole bunch of players that want them to reconsider. So they gave this is a I read it all the other day. I won't bore the audience with the whole letter. They can go on Connor's X page at Connor J. Clark with an E at the end, or you can just see it on screen here if you're watching. But audio listeners, go check out that on Twitter. It was a well written letter, very professional, and then at the end, it's signed by a whole list of players, who I'd imagine are well known and lesser known guys. But there's two full pages of people's names. And then, and just as a side note, I looked through the comments the other day. There's 362 comments on this. A lot of these are complaining about the letter itself and completely ignoring it. And it was just, as a person who's on the outside looking in, who's not involved in this community at all, it came, a lot of the stuff came across as pretty petty. There's stuff complaining, oh, they had to put it in double spaces because there weren't enough names. Oh, it looks like there's a list of people we need to ban from the tournament also. It's very, stereotypical of a far left, reaction to this, not addressing any of the concerns at all. And what you told me was that some of these people who are on this list, who were kind enough to sign their name in support of just saying, hey, let's actually find out, let's actually kind of discuss what happened here. Let's kind of discuss that we shouldn't maybe ban somebody based on a hat or based on anonymous complaints. Let's at least discuss it. And
Right.
what you told me was people are actually getting threats from that. Did it go as far as threats at their job or anything? Tell the audience about what the reaction was to this letter from, uh, if there was good reaction from people and bad reaction from people, just to be fair.
Yeah, sure. So the list of names, I mean, it's a very moderately worded letter. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
we weren't really like controversial with any of the statements in the letter, at least in my view, by any means. Um, in fact, there was a whole lot more that I felt like really maybe should have been said, but it may have fallen on deaf ears, given the target audience is kind of the opposite side of the spectrum. And we really wanted to tread lightly so everyone could kind of look at this and say, like, yeah, you know what, this is something that everyone can get behind. In fact, most of the names on that list are people that do not agree with me politically. They just disagree with what happened here, and then the treatment over recent years, that I received for political bias. But so yeah, some of the retaliation was well, first of all, I'll say a lot of names. There's 154, I think, on there originally, and some of them are well-known players, some of them not so much. But a lot of players that are like professional players expressed to me that they didn't want to put their name on the list. Some of them because they're contractually obligated not to make public political statements, but most of them were because they were afraid that the retaliation, they would lose endorsements, they would lose their status on the team in the game, or corporate sponsorships, or whatever that the case may be. And many of the names on the list, well, many of the names on the list received backlash in one form or another. Some instances were more egregious than others. Um, I mean, some people were yes doxxed at their place of employment. Some people were threatened at losing their team. One guy lost his hotel room.
Jeez.
A lot of people like lost friendships and stuff like that over this whole thing. Um, And it's really unfortunate, that like it seems to me, in my view, that this was a pretty moderate stance that like I would think that everyone, or at least I would hope that everyone could agree that when someone has received punishment where they're not allowed to play at the largest tournament of the year, and there was pretty significant financial damage as a result. I had to pay for a house and shut my business down for a week and stuff like that. But I don't care so much about that. But like when these types of like real world actions are taken against somebody, that we kind of hope that there is some way to at least see that these are legitimate complaints. And there really wasn't any type of that here, and seems like the sentiment is, yeah, you shouldn't know who the person is making the complaints because that person could be afraid of retaliation. Although I've never seen, any type of punitive action that way. Um, so it seemed like to me like a pretty general principle that everyone could get behind. But a lot of these people, I mean, we got a lot of screenshots from that people showed us where not only were people getting doxxed and extorted into like giving money to charities that they may or may not have supported otherwise, but they were like kind of pseudo canceled, and then basically as your penance you have to give money to this charity, and to show that you're on the right team and things like that. And that was kind of the most egregious part of this, I think, is that like how not so much that those individual actions were happening, because I guess you can't really put an expectation on an individual's behavior, but that we have a culture at this point where that behavior, like those individuals felt comfortable, like posting pictures of their messages, engaging in that behavior and bragging about it as if they knew that the community would celebrate them for doing the right thing, for doxing and extorting these people for signing their names on this letter. To me, that's a symptom of a much larger problem than any individual engaging in the behavior could really be. Um, but so I mean, we did come to a resolution with Card
Mm-hmm.
Titan, and
I'll show that
basically
now.
yeah, yeah. So basically, we came to a joint statement, and the statement says, I mean, you could read it verbatim if you like, or I can
Yeah, it's short.
kind of, yeah,
It's
sure.
pretty short. I'll read it out here. Statement of common ground. Card Titan and Joe Brennan. I've spoken extensively with both Card Titan and Joe Brennan, um, and hundreds of others in recent days. And this is coming from Connor Clark again. Connor J. Clark with an E on X. Joe and Card Titan do not agree on everything, but they do agree on a lot, including this. First and most importantly, threats and bullying have no place in Magic. In recent days, there have been far too much of both in all directions. This is a sincere plea from everyone involved. Please bring the temperature down. Let us find unity in our shared love for the game. Second, political discrimination has no place in Magic. The game is for everyone, from left to right. Wearing a MAGA hat, even though many find it offensive, is not a legitimate reason to remove someone from a Card Titan event. Third, it is Card Titan's sincere judgment that Joe's exclusion from the 2025 Eternal Weekend was not based on his hat, but on reported conduct alone. So again, the Eternal Weekend is the annual tournament. I think they skipped a COVID year or two, so it's been going on for a long time. I think it was 11 years. But the letter continues. I accept the sincerity of this conclusion. Joe accepts the outcome. Though he has not seen the exact complaints, strongly disputes the process and rejects the many heinous allegations made against him online, Joe plans to return to the tournament in 2026. Fourth and lastly, Card Titan acknowledges that its process in the instance was highly flawed, and it has committed to improve the process going forward. Joe accepts their commitment to this. Connor Clark signed it with permission of Joe and Card Titan. Now, you told me personally that you were very surprised at this outcome. You were very pleased with this outcome. So you guys contacted them and had a little meeting or a phone call, or how did that happen? And are these guys you're talking to from this company, are they typically left wing? So was it hard for them to come across the aisle, or do they more so, agree with you, and they get a lot of backlash from the community into, don't allow this guy to play? Like, sort of like, what has their historical position been, and why were you so surprised and happy with the outcome?
Well, no, I think Card Titan does a pretty good job generally of staying at least publicly apolitical. I mean, obviously, this is a game that is going to inherently cater towards a more left-wing audience, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. And like, certainly that's true with the staff at Card Titan as well. But their political views didn't seem to really, at any point to me, um, be relevant in this whole thing. In fact, the manager at Card Titan that I've been kind of coordinating with the whole time, like, I mean, he expressed himself. He's like, "Yeah, dude, I know that like this isn't right. There's a lot of like, you know, things that are wrong with this situation. The timing of it, the whole, not being allowed to know the accusations, all this and that." But, it seemed to like he was very friendly and easy to deal with the whole time. And I expecting nothing less of him. I've always had a high opinion of the guy. I've known him for many years. Um, Unfortunately, the owner, for whatever reason that I've also been friends with for many years, has not returned my call or responded to my messages or anything like that. And I don't know why that is. Maybe legal reasons or whatever the case may be. Although there was never like a lawsuit or anything involved with this. I can only speculate. But no, the guy was really good to deal with. And to me, so the cons of this resolution that we came to were obviously that I'm not going to be allowed to play at Eternal Weekend this year. Um, from what I understand, that's from the impression they gave me that that was not going to be the same moving forward. That would be fine going to any of the events moving forward, and that I would not be allowed to know the reasons why. And obviously, to me, that's the most frustrating part. Um, but in exchange, for the first time ever, at least that I'm aware of, in this game, a very large organizer is publicly condemning the political discrimination and saying that everybody's welcome on the left and the right, and that wearing a MAGA hat is not grounds for removal from the tournament.
So you see it as a
That's
step in the right direction, then?
a huge step. Not only like this type of discrimination has always been, at the very least, accepted and often encouraged in this little subculture that I play this game in. And this is the first time on a very large scale that we've, gotten a large organizer to say no, no, discrimination is not okay, regardless of in what direction it's coming from or going. That everybody is welcome. I mean, there's t-shirts, and I kind of laugh at them when I see them. They're usually like a rainbow flag t-shirt. They're from Magic the Gathering, and they say magic is for everyone. And I laugh at it when I see it because that certainly has not been my experience. But no, I think that this is a huge step in the right direction, and that's what I want to do. Like, I've already done all the things that a Magic player could hope to achieve in this game. I've got all the trophies from all the tournaments, all the goals that little kids want to have in this game in the format that I play. I've achieved them all. But the one thing that I haven't achieved is that the community now is far more toxic and far more exclusive and bigoted than it was when I started playing this game in 1993. Far, far more. And I'm not really comfortable with that. I think that men have a responsibility to try to leave the world in a little better place than when we found it, regardless of what that situation is. Like, whether it's just putting a shopping cart back in a Home Depot parking lot after you're done shopping, or just leaving somebody with a bigger smile on their face than when they woke up this morning because you were kind to them in a grocery store, or whatever it is. And certainly the case is that is the case as well here in this community, and it is a far worse place than it is the way that I found it. And if the last thing that I do in this game is I end up, stopping playing this game at some point, and I can say to myself in my head that, yeah, 15, 20 years from now, some guy with different viewpoints, just like me, feels welcome, and this guy may never even know my name, feels a little more welcome than I did sitting down and playing this game with his friends. And, in some part, maybe my actions help contribute to that. Well, then that's an achievement. That's, you know what I mean? That's something that I could really hang my hat on. And, and I certainly can't say that right now in this community, but I do think that this is a step in the right direction. You know?
For me growing up, and I want to get touch on that a little bit more of what you think the next steps might be. For me growing up, I had friends playing this. I had friends doing Warhammer. I've always had friends playing video games, all these types of genres of things. And there was never, I guess I didn't bring it into adulthood other than gaming, but there were still the people I know now who are sort of into that stuff. Don't um they don't disagree with me politically, I guess is what I'm trying to say. When did you start to notice that people were starting to be outward with this type of behavior, or this type of, harassment or bullying or whatever you want to describe it as? Did that start with Trump, or was there some sort of other form of it? You say you've been playing it since
Yeah.
basically the beginning, like in the year 2000. Were we anti-goth or something? Like what did it start
Yeah.
as?
No, it was very apolitical. I mean, in the 90s, everything was apolitical.
Mm-hmm.
The whole country was apolitical. It was just a discussion of, one side wanted higher taxes and more services, and the other side wanted lower taxes and less services. And nobody really cared which way anybody voted, although I would have been considered pretty left wing when I was younger. In fact, I spent a lot of years on the streets. I spent many years hopping freight trains and hitchhiking around the country and going to rainbow gatherings and music festivals and stuff. And I spent a lot of time on the streets protesting the Patriot Act and the Iraq War. And then, after that, the whole big pharma corruption scandal with Eli Lilly and Pfizer that led to the opiate epidemic, and the weapons of mass destruction lie that was parroted on all sides of the media. And then during the Obama years, the Seven Dwarfs program with the NSA were, spying on all U.S. citizens and everything. And, to me, I always looked at it as like, I'm more like an anarcho-libertarian guy. I don't really trust any government. Um, and I guess probably during the middle, like maybe in Obama's second term, it probably started to get really polarized when like it became a lot about like, the whole like inspiration of a color revolution, in my view, kind of, the the racial politics got very involved and very divisive. But then after Obama cut all the union workers' pensions, and my dad suffered greatly as a result of that. He worked 35 years busting his ass in the carpenters union just for Obama to stroke a pen and, cut a large portion of his pension. And now he's really not left with much after working his ass off his whole life. To me, that was kind of the final straw. And, you know, um, Trump was talking about a lot of the things that I had certainly agreed with, with government corruption. And he has a lot of his own flaws too. I'm not really sold on a lot of the things that Trump does, although I think that he's far and away the best president of my lifetime. But admittedly, that's a pretty damn low bar. So, but
So was there anything else in Magic? Like it was just basically normal up until the Trump era, or until you
yeah,
started
I
really.
don't even know that it was during Trump's first term. The When I really saw it, maybe towards the end of his first term, well, I guess as a country, the media really went crazy um, over the election of Trump. Once he got elected the first time, it was like they had lost their minds because, you know, I mean, different minds may differ on opinion, but I just view the media as kind of like the mouthpiece of the corporate establishment that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really have the citizens' best interest at heart. I mean, from what I understand, 80% of media funding nowadays comes from pharmaceutical companies. So, like, clearly they're going to have a bias that's going to skew in favor of those that they're getting their money from. And nowadays, I mean, certainly back then it used to be a left wing thing that we were protesting the pharmaceutical corruption, but it certainly flipped the script during the vax mandates and all that stuff during the lockdowns. Um, and same thing with war. I was on the street protesting war 25 years ago, and if you went up to the average left winger on the street at that point and said, 20, 25 years later, I guess 20 years later, that the left were going to be the ones that were going to be forcibly, injecting people with their biggest donor's latest experimental drug and expanding wars overseas and voting 100% of the time to fund all of the wars overseas, um, that nobody would have believed you. That would have been no way. That's going to be a Republican thing. But to me, it's kind of
Hmm.
like they're kind of like two wings of the same bird. I just happen to think that Trump is a little better than all the other ones, and he did a lot for me personally. The previous administration targeted me pretty harshly. Um, I don't know how much you want me to get into this, but I can if you'd like to. It was pretty egregious scenario that, I mean, Trump just fixed at the snap of his fingers as soon as he got inaugurated this time.
Well,
Um, go ahead.
let me ask you this, because I think, well, obviously you've been involved in politics a long time, or at least been aware of politics for a long time. What
Hmm.
I see when I look at like the post of the letter, and people are doing their typical thing of not addressing it, calling it Nazis and everything, and all the things I found calling you all these types of names. It seems pretty typical of me, typical of that, progressive genre of politics to be reacting this way. And I think one of the issues that happens, especially in these scenarios, like I mentioned, where card shops have trans flags and coffee shops and board game shops, they all have this stuff, and then when they see something else, they're like, no, that's banned. I think that they don't see it as political. They see it as so unpolitical that it's quote unquote normal. So therefore, it's okay to bash that. It's so normal what they believe that this is amazing, and when somebody comes along with a MAGA hat or something they disagree with, it's so outrageous and egregious that it's okay to make fun of that thing or try to destroy that thing because it's so irregular, even though of course you live in the United States and Trump has won 2 elections now, so and gained more votes over the last 3 elections each time, that statistically you would say, okay, this isn't a small thing, but they sort of act like it is, like something that is so egregious that it's worthy of crushing. Now, I said all that to say, do you think that you're going to have success moving forward in the Magic community, getting it to be more unbiased, getting people to calm down, or I forget what the word the letter used over here, but tone, like lessen the tone and
Less
calm
than the
things down?
temperature.
Yeah, exactly. Lower the temperature on things. Do you think you're going to be successful with that? Is that just a hope of yours, or are there some sort of other next steps that you've thought about or discussed with people moving forward to kind of achieve that goal, which I think is very noble of you to want to, have this accomplishment in your sport, let's call it.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing I would say is that, like, it's probably a lot more nuanced discussion of whether you would consider like trans flags to be a political thing. But to me, it's a lot clearer that there are other things that are overtly political that have been allowed in this community. Um, like the ones that I mentioned, like the From the Rivers to the Sea stuff, and all that stuff. I think that like the transgender stuff is more of like a nuanced conversation. And I wouldn't want to fall into the trap of saying that like it is typical of the progressives to just kind of like, shout obscenities and things like that, not really engage in the actual conversation. Although I may feel that way, it's certainly true on both sides to some extent, at least in my view. And I think that it, as far as the success of, my goal of trying to help bring the community together and make it a more welcoming place for everybody, those results are kind of not something that are within my control. Like, I mean, I view it as like I have a responsibility to put in the footwork. The results are kind of up to God, in whatever form God takes in your mind. I'm not a very religious person, but that's kind of how I view these types of things. That like I'm not in the results business. I'm in the footwork business. You know what I mean? And I know that it is my responsibility to try to be the change that I want to see in the world. And I'll say this, that like I don't believe that the people on the other side are necessarily bad or evil people. I think that they truly believe, like they've been made to truly believe that they're like hunting fascists, that they're like, I mean, I know it sounds like really absurd and crazy, but they believe that. You know what I mean? So like I try to put myself in the shoes of like, if I believe that, I may be able to justify all sorts of behavior in my head that wouldn't otherwise be acceptable. And I believe that many of them truly believe that. Like this is especially during the lockdowns, man. Like I think that a lot of people really lost their sense. Um, they cut off all forms of social interaction to people who lived in some states, in many states, all forms of social interaction, and then they basically glued these people with an adhesive made out of fear to their television sets where they were just stuck in front of the propaganda machine for years. And this is the end result is a mass formation psychosis, but they're not necessarily bad people, man. They're just like we're all just people. Like we're all just people. It's just they're made to believe something that somebody else is benefiting from convincing them of. And it helps if we treat people with compassion and with love and with an understanding, like not to say that like we shouldn't like advocate for what we believe and what we believe to be true in a loving, non-confrontational and inviting manner. But someone has to have grace in this situation. Someone has to take the high road. Someone has to be the responsible adult. And if the responsible adult is just shouting obscenities back at the obscenities that are being shouted at them from the children, then we're never going to get anywhere.
We're just all people, man. No, you make very good points. I have to make jokes, or else I'm
Yeah,
not.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
uh,
I get it. Look, I mean, it's such a hyperbolic
mm-hmm.
thing nowadays, and it happens to be exaggerated greatly in the magic community because of how hyper politicized this little subculture is. But we got to find a solution. And I don't know if the things that I'm doing are going to make a difference, but I know that I sure as hell can't live with myself if I don't try.
No, I think it's really big of you to want to do this, to even, you know, after all this time playing, to even want to take this song. How old are you, by the way?
I'm 38,
You're 38. Okay, you've been playing since you were 5, then, or 4,
6. Yeah.
6. Okay, yeah, we're pretty much the same age then. Or
Mhm.
even though I tell people I'm 19.
Yeah. I took a 10-year
You're supposed to
hiatus
laugh at
to.
that, don't worry.
I, I
Really?
I
So,
took
go
took a
ahead.
10-year hiatus to hop freight trains and hitchhike around the country when I was younger, but yeah.
That's very Red Dead Revolver of you. I like that. Let me ask you some generic questions for people like myself who aren't as familiar with the popularity of Magic cards. Is it, from what I see and lived the last few years, stuff like this is exploding or has exploded, starting to come down a little bit. But in general, the graph, like the economy, when it goes down like this, it's still actually way up. But in general, most of these things have shot up in the last few years. Is the same with Magic the Gathering? Have you seen a huge influx of people in the last, let's say, 5 years, especially people who were into it when they were younger, maybe bringing it back into their lives? And how big are some of the biggest tournaments? How many people are playing in those?
So it's kind of hard to say to answer that question accurately because the lockdowns played such a large part in it.
Mm,
Um,
right, because it is an in-person thing. So,
I mean, people play online as well, although I mean, I do very, very, um, very infrequently. But certainly there used to be a pretty thriving vintage community where our local tournaments, when I say local, I mean like an hour and a half drive of, the northeastern US. Like when at the time I was living in New Jersey, I now live in Pennsylvania. But I could play every Saturday and every Sunday within an hour and a half drive of my house. Um, each weekend, probably somewhere between 35 and 60 people, which was pretty good for vintage because vintage is it's a very expensive format. I had to win a lot of tournaments to kind of build up to have the cards to actually play. Um, Although many of the tournaments allow the cards to be, proxied for people who don't
Mm.
have own the actual cards, so more people can be included. But that was kind of like in the heyday. That was like the 2015, 2016, and then 2017 it started to die out a lot. And those tournaments halved in frequency and halved in size. And then I really tried to make an effort to revitalize the community. Probably, well, I kind of always did this, but I really doubled down my efforts in like 2017, where every tournament I would make sure that I had a car full of people that I would lend cards to, and I would pick them up from all around and bring them to tournaments. And we would be, so we'd show up with 5 people at the tournament, and I ported a lot of people over from other formats and got them interested in playing this format. And the community started to grow again, and in 2019 it started to get pretty healthy again. The tournaments were not as frequent or as well populated as they were in 2016, but it was more than it was in 2018. And then I won the championship in 2019. It was like this big thing. And then shortly after that, we had the lockdowns. And particularly in the Northeast, it was really so there were a lot of tournaments in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, in Connecticut, and in New York. So when the lockdowns happened, I mean, you could still play tournaments in Pennsylvania, but
Mm.
not in New Jersey and New York. In fact, you couldn't even meet publicly in New York unless you had paperwork showing that you had taken an injection. You weren't allowed to meet publicly with other people until the court struck that down. So the general mindset in New York, now it was already kind of a little bit tough for Pennsylvania residents to come to New York and New Jersey. Like we lost a handful of people that would only stay in Pennsylvania because of the gun laws in New Jersey and New York. Like if you're a concealed carrier in Pennsylvania, you can't really cross over to New Jersey, and you're crossing
Mm.
over with a high value dollar amount in cards. But the New York and
So
New Jersey guys
let
would
me
always
interrupt you
come.
there. So
Yeah.
guys are carrying such expensive cards that they're carrying guns with them.
Well, I wouldn't even say that that's why they're carrying. I mean, like a quarter of the people in Pennsylvania carry. I think it's like
Oh, nice.
17, 20% have a license to carry, but you only need a license to conceal, not to open carry. But it is more incentive if you're already someone who carries regularly. If you're walking around with $250,000 worth of cardboard in your bag, like how much do you want to go to New York City and
Mm-hmm.
disarm yourself where you're at a higher risk? So that's a factor too. But the people from New York and New Jersey would always come to Pennsylvania. And during the lockdowns and all the
Mm-hmm.
media hype and everything, many of the people in Pennsylvania didn't want to take the injections. And the people in New York were like adamant about, we're not going to interact with you if you're not taking this injection because you're a threat to the public. And I mean, the things that were told. I mean, at least before Pfizer testified to Parliament, that none of that was ever true. Um, but so basically, you had this divide of like a community that was just kind of recovering. We were just coming out of physical therapy and starting to walk again. And then you had this divide where your tournaments might have been getting at like the mid 20s of people in attendance, like 24 people. Well, now you're not getting any support from the state neighboring state. So now you're down to like 10 or 12 people. And even some of the people that live locally were, like, oh, we're not going to go out and meet publicly. They believed a lot of the things that were being said on the media, for whether some of them had any merit or not. I'm not going to get into the weeds on that, but there was a serious cultural influence on the support for the game, basically. Now I think that it's really on an uptick pretty significantly. Um, I mean, so the vintage main event this weekend here in Pittsburgh, I think had close to 500 players, which I believe was the second
Wow.
biggest one ever. And then the legacy main event had, I want to say, roughly 1,000 players.
Whew.
So that's pretty, that's a good amount of people at the convention center.
Yeah, and that's like, no matter what it is, because obviously I don't play it, but no matter what it is, when people are like, it seems so much more valuable these days for people to get together and do something they like that. And especially back in the day when people didn't know as much that these things were going on unless they were really involved in it. So people are able to see that. And I'm all for having people get together for these types of things, no matter what it is. basically whatever your jam is, really, in terms of this sort of stuff, I can really get behind it. Whether, I don't know if people have risk tournaments or something, but I would consider going to one of those if that was a thing. And I hope this all works out, and I hope you're able to continue and if this never happens, and Card Titan is the first person to make like one of these statements like this, just being like, this is not just a reason to ban somebody. You're going to have to deal with his hat, and he's going to deal with your shirt or whatever it is, and we're all going to get along like normal people would. And if you guys want to argue about it, then do it like people who are able to handle it, but don't just freak out about it. And I think what you're doing is right, and I hope it works out, and I hope it doesn't just spiral to like, because people are going to see this and they're going to be like, look, he went on a neo-Nazi podcast and an anti-trans podcast and all this sort of stuff. And so I think it takes a certain amount of courage from yourself to be able to put yourself out there and be the guy who says, I'm going to, as you put it, be the adult in the room. So I hope everything works out for you on that front.
Well,
is there
people
anything else you want to mention?
Yeah, people are going to say that regardless, right? Like, so I'm not on social media, but I'm and these last 2 weeks have certainly confirmed my decision of a couple decades ago to not engage in that type of thing. But, I think that some of the inconsistencies kind of expose themselves, right? Like, people are always going to engage in that. Like, they're going to scream Nazi from the corner, and they're never going to, and that's true on both sides. People are going to make unfounded claims on both sides. But I think that the reasonable people who are going to view this whole situation are going to look at this and say, wow, a lot of people made a lot of claims about Joe, but nobody actually brought any evidence. They were just, and then when they were confronted, they just said, well, he's a Nazi, and I think that the reasonable minds, which I like to believe is still a large portion of society, is going to look at that and say, you know what, maybe we need to take a step back and take a look at this and say that, like, this isn't really how we want to, organize our society moving forward. And some people are not going to, but that's always going to be reality. Nobody's ever going to be on board with everything, but cooler heads will always prevail. Yeah, I guess I don't really have a whole lot more on that topic. I just really, we need to come together, man. Like, this toxicity and polarization is just crazy. It's just like, I would ask anybody who's listening, play out the current trajectory to its inevitable conclusion. And 10 years from now, is that a world you want to live? That's all I'm saying.
All right, Joe, I appreciate everything you've said today. I appreciate you coming on here, and I appreciate what you're doing for your scene, I'll call it. And in my experience, people from Pennsylvania have been very nice. I love people make fun of my accent, but I enjoy the Pennsylvanian accent.
Yeah, you have a bit of a Canadian accent.
And I think there's some sort of crossover with how people live there. Oh, do I? It comes out, Joe. It comes out, all right?
But you're down in Texas, right?
Maybe I do.
Yeah.
And maybe you guys, what is it? No, I am Canadian.
But you live in Texas, though?
You've picked it out.
Yeah.
No, I wish.
Okay. You could pull off Minnesota. You could certainly pull off the Minnesota.
Of course. Or Michigan. Yeah, I just basically call them. But the Pennsylvania is on the A's, the bads, and and stuff like that. But anyways, all right. I appreciate you. Thanks for coming on. I said that already, and I guess you'll be back. When's the next tournament you're going to be in?
So, the next major tournament will be in Lucca in Italy in the end of November. Oh, wow. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll be in, I think Japan is Yokohama this year. It's outside of Tokyo.
Wow. So world traveling for this is awesome, and I definitely support that. All right. Thanks a lot, Joe. Have a good night, okay?
Yeah, buddy. You too. Bye.